Women Against Fundamentalism as an organization is stopped to exist, but many of us who used to belong to it, but also beyond it, sorry, I speak with my hand, have recently started a journal online, so it will be accessible globally and freely, called Feminist Dissent, a journal on gender and fundamentalism. So I brought some leaflets about it as well. So while issues of fundamentalisms, myself also look at issues of nationalist and ethnic as well as religious fundamentalisms, have been a very problematic issues, I think, both in the left generally and in the anti-racist and in the feminist movements as well. Recently, there have been a growing recognition of the issue. So, for example, in addition to this journal and so on, AWID, which is the largest international women's organization about issues of women and development and human rights, have started to have a whole kind of forum about gender and fundamentalism, both as a major stream in its general conference, but also we had some special separate meetings, because the issues are very, very severe and very, very important. I want to talk about it in kind of 3 or 4 different distinct areas, and if I can incorporate some of the things that Pragna was going to talk about, specifically to the case of the UK. First of all, what is a global as well context for the rise of fundamentalist movements and how we should interpret them? Secondly, the extent or the relationship of anti-racism and fundamentalism. I remember a year or 2 ago when we actually launched the book, a very actually bright and feminist postgraduate student in Warwick opened big eyes to me and said, "Are you trying to tell me you can be both anti-racist and anti-fundamentalist?" And I think this is something that needs to be looked at. And also, how do we, the whole issue of feminism and fundamentalism. In the session on the Middle East before lunch, Celine was talking about the problematization of the binarism between religious and secular and within the kind of the feminist issue. And I think this is a very important reflection. In AWID, for example, we have both resistant to fundamentalism within, like the organization Sisters in Islam, as well as from outside, like women living under Muslim law. I put 2 examples in relation to Islam, but of course it's very, very important to understand that fundamentalism has risen in all major religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, as well as Sikhism, Hinduism, and probably most paradoxically at all, Buddhism as well.
Oh yes, in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think when we talk about the global context, I don't have time to expand on it, but I relate to it as a double crisis of governability and governmentality. This is the context of the neoliberalism, the global neoliberalism that the whole conference is talking about. I think one kind of simple example is that the combined wealth of all nation states in the whole world is less than 1/10 of the combined wealth of some of the big multinational corporations. So the power to resist and to be able to govern as representatives of the citizen rather than as negotiator between the interests of the multinationals and of government is very limited. I mean, the most extreme example is what happened with Syriza in Greece. Here you have, you know, a fantastic political program and the best will in the world, and at the moment in Greece, not only a very aggressive privatization of the state and enslavement of the citizen there for generations. So this is why more and more people feel that they don't want to vote, they don't want to be active in relation to government, and yet, of course, supposedly democratic government needs a legitimacy of the votes and of the citizens. So here, I mean, neoliberalism, as Foucault has discussed and others, have kind of created this notion of governmentality that everybody is responsible for themselves and what happened to them and to their health and well-being, as well as to their economic success and rights. And really, people are clients of the state rather than citizens with rights and duties. And people started to rebel against that. So there is a crisis of this governmentality because people feel this disempowerment of they cannot be represented rightly by their government, and yet they don't see any effectiveness because all the even most beautiful social movements like Occupy and the Global Social Forum and all this kind of thing, they are wonderful in terms of principles and ideals, but in terms of decision-making mechanism and created some kind of social and political alternatives, they have faltered, and this is a separate discussion. So one of the results of that is the rise of populist movements, both in the North and in the South, authoritarian and supposedly non-authoritarian. And I live in the UK. Brexit is one direct result of this feeling, and this is, again, a separate discussion. But the feeling of disempowerment as a result of restructuring and the failure of post-colonial revolutions and secular nationalism to solve the problem of the South have started before. So I think religious fundamentalist movement has arisen everywhere, but I think they started in the South because the secular nationalist movements have failed. But even more so, Partha Chatterjee talked about the power of mimicry, that in a way the independent movement in the Third World started by mimicry of the modernism of the West, but part of the Western nationalist idea was of the nationalist so-called pure culture and golden age and so on. So in the search for authenticity of the South, their own culture, their own ideas, so modern movements that started in the South by forcibly de-veiling women kind of continued by forcibly veiling women, because of course women have always been the symbol of the collectivity, the nation, the caste, the tribe, etc. So in this sense, we find that 9/11 and the securitization, I mean, part of it, of course, was the post-Soviet, kind of the post-Cold War. Again, there's no time to go about it, but the securitization and the so-called global war of terrorism also created a reaction of what some of us call the technology of everyday bordering. I think in the previous session about the Middle East, when Farida was talking about that everybody is hating each other and suspicious of each other and people are being deported. This, for example, is a reality in Britain and in many other kind of places. Instead of convivial, pluralist coexistence, suddenly the saliency of whether or not you are legally entitled to be here or even informally entitled. People who don't speak English on the phone in the tube suddenly are being kind of challenged, if not attacked. And I've been teaching in British universities since the early 70s, but now I have to produce, whenever I'm asked to examine a PhD or whatever, that I'm actually legally allowed to work in the UK. So it undermines any kind of social solidarity and social cohesion just when the formal narrative of the government is about social cohesion. And a lot of this social cohesion was supposed to be a reaction to the global war on terrorism to differentiate between so-called the terrorists and our Muslim. It was mostly Muslim, of course, the whole thing is very racialized, but of course also other BME religious minorities. So from culture, it became collapsed to religion. There was an imposition that in this post-racial, post-class, post-gender inequality society, religious differentiation became the only legitimate identity difference. And at the time when there was this kind, what some of us, and Pragna is very central in talking about the transition from multiculturalism to multi-faithism, because at the time for organizations like Southern Black Sisters, which where Pragna works, the funding was withdrawn because you cater only for minority women and not for everybody in this assemblaged universalist kind of time. Tens of projects for Muslim and especially Muslim women were established in the same borough which withdrew the funding from Southern Black Sisters. So they won the court case, but many other organizations less kind of famous and grounded than Southern Black Sisters did not. So this was a reaction of the state, and the reaction of the people has been this kind of populism. So of course, with this kind of time, with the attack, the racialized attack on all minorities, including, of course, religious minorities, especially Islam, all this rhetoric against the Muslim taking over Europe and so on, it is very easy to think that if you are criticizing any kind of political ideology which constructs itself as a religious ideology, then you are racist. Our argument is the opposite, that this kind of sense of guilt and that the left is very hesitant from criticizing any kind of political or social or cultural ideology of minorities is itself racist because it homogenizes and reifies all of the minority people or all these people who belong to this community. This is why we say that intersectional analysis is so important for any kind of socialist feminist politics. And you have this kind of situation in which, for example, another prominent member of WAF and Dissent, Gita Zagal, used to be the head of the gender unit in Amnesty International. And Amnesty is a very important human rights defender organization, but and of course they defended against the Guantanamo Bay and all the terrible things that is happening there. But Muazzam Beg, one of the people who created the organization Cage Prisoners, is a fundamentalist. However, they defended him, they presented him as a human rights defender. And as long as people are not being killed by the members of this organization in England, then it seems to the government and to the society, including the left, to say they are okay, they are one of us. And people from the left, and especially from because women very often are the targets of this kind of ideologies and organization, we're saying by legitimizing this organization in the West, or in the North, you are giving license to what they are doing to us in the South. So the whole issue of the needing to look at the global perspective, because we should work in terms of local solidarity as well as local, but of course they are also working in this way, and you have to recognize the sophistication of the use of social media, the use of any kind of IT and communication ideologies. So in terms of the feminist organizations, I think this has been very important to deal with it, both in terms of concrete politics, but also in terms of feminist solidarity theorization. Because what we had in terms of feminist theory, we have on the one hand Nancy Fraser, which rightly talked about the fact that feminist discourse has been kind of taken over by neoliberal global forces, and it has been used, for example, to justify the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and all this kind of thing. But the fact that this has been true and that the feminist movement itself is not a homogeneous kind of body, and there are quite contradictory voices against it, does not mean that feminism as such, and especially socialist feminism, which inherently link feminist liberation, women's liberation, into other forms of human emancipation in terms of class, race, stage in the life cycle, and so on. It shouldn't be used in order to discredit feminism, which has been this case. So this is kind of on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the rise of feminist, or so-called, I think, feminist theoreticians like Saba Mahmood, although other people like Fadia Nadil and even Rosie Bardiotti kind of, I think, fell into this kind of trap of the so-called the post-secular age, and in a way criticizes, like Saba Mahmood did her PhD on pious women in a mosque in Cairo. And she talked about the fact that the empowerment that pious women get by being more pious and devoted and so on is, in that context, what this feminist empowerment should be. That any attempt to apply so-called Western, so-called universal principle of liberation on these women is in itself, imperialist, racist, Westocentric, Eurocentric. And this is a very important issue. It's not that it's a question of religion or secularism in the sense of atheism. Women Against Fundamentalism talked about the importance of secular spaces, which is a pluralist spaces between religious and atheists, for example. It's not a negation of personal choice in terms of religious, but it's against imposition that all legitimate identities will be constructed in religious terms, and there will be this homogenization and reification of everybody. And by constructing this relativism, cultural relativism, that for Muslim women, liberation means piety, this is in itself, I think, very sexist, very racist. And in this sense, we have to negotiate the interrelationship between respect for cultural, social as well as individual constructions of identity and belonging. And the fact that in particular social situation, the priorities of particular women, for example, would be different than in other positioning. From the situated gaze, for example, of middle-aged woman in a polygamic society in which if she would be divorced, she will not be denied any subsistence, any access to her children, let alone social respect. Polygamy is not the worst kind of choice in this particular situation. However, this does not mean that when we talk about feminist and socialist feminist notions of liberation and emancipation, that we would endorse that polygamy is the best kind of feminist kind of ideology. And this is part of this kind of collapsing that some feminist kind of so-called post-secular traps are falling into. I think there are a lot of issues that I tried kind of a cook tour of in a very dense way. I hope there will be some kind of space to discuss them, but I think it's very, very important for any kind of socialist feminism today not just to relate to issues of work as well as reproduction, but to look also at the way in which construction, I think what we heard about what is happening in the Middle East, but also in Latin America and as well as in Europe, the reconstruction of the traditional so-called, I think when we say gender justice rather than gender equality, naturalization of gender relation on the one hand, and the neoliberal kind of denial of any kind of gender constructions. I think it's very significant that a large proportion of the populist extreme right leaders in Europe are women, as well as, of course, the Prime Minister now in Britain and so on. So gender politics cannot be reduced to the traditional kind of women just stay at home. A lot of the power of conservative and populist women is by going to the public sphere and yet preach this kind of natural division of labor between the gender. Thank you very much.